Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Tonight, we're going to travel together to a very different place and time, to a collection of muddy islands in a shallow lagoon, where refugees fleeing barbarian invasions would build something extraordinary. We're going to discover how Venice, born from desperation and salt water, became the banking capital of the medieval world. We'll meet merchants and money changers, watch as financial innovations emerge from practical problems, and slowly piece together how a city built on nothing but mud and ambition taught Europe how to manage money. If you drift away during our journey, that's perfectly fine. That's exactly what we're here for. Let the story wash over you like gentle waves in the lagoon. There's nowhere you need to be. Let's begin in the mud, in the 5th century, when the world was ending. The year is 402, and if you lived anywhere in northern Italy, you would know that your world was collapsing. For 5 centuries, Rome had been eternal, unshakable, the centre of everything. The roads were Roman, the laws were Roman, the coins in your purse bore Roman faces. Even the gods, until recently, had been Roman. The empire had seemed as permanent as the mountains, as inevitable as the changing seasons. But empires, like everything else, are fragile. They depend on systems working, on soldiers being paid, on grain shipments arriving, on distant provinces sending taxes to the capital. When those systems break down, when the legions withdraw, when the money runs out, everything that seemed solid can dissolve with shocking speed. The Gothic King Alaric sacked Rome itself in 410. This was supposed to be impossible. Rome hadn't fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years, but it happened. The Eternal City burned, its treasures were looted, its citizens were killed or enslaved. And suddenly, everyone in the Italian peninsula understood that nowhere was safe. Then came the Huns. Attila, whose name would become synonymous with destruction, swept into northern Italy in 452. His armies moved like a force of nature, destroying everything in their path. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash in days. Aquileia, one of the greatest cities of the north, wealthy and proud and powerful, resisted the Huns for 3 months. When it finally fell, Attila ordered it so thoroughly destroyed that, according to legend, not one stone was left standing upon another. Now, imagine you're a citizen of Aquileia or Padua, or any of the cities in the Huns' path. You have some warning. Refugees fleeing ahead of the army have brought news of what's coming. You can't fight. The legions are gone, withdrawn to defend Rome itself, or simply disbanded for lack of pay. Your city walls might hold for a while, but they'll fall eventually. You have a choice to make, and you have to make it quickly. Do you stay and hope for mercy, or do you run? Those who ran faced an obvious problem. Where do you go? Every city, every town, every fortified place is either already fallen or will fall soon. Attila's army moves faster than you can. The roads that Rome built, those magnificent straight roads that connected the empire, now serve the invaders as much as the invaded. Anywhere you can easily reach, the Huns can reach more easily. But there was one place that horses couldn't go, one place that no army could easily reach. One place that offered, if not comfort, at least the possibility of survival. The lagoon. If you've never seen the Venetian lagoon, it's hard to understand how strange and marginal a landscape it is. It's neither land nor sea, but something in between. Shallow water, treacherous to navigate, filled with shifting sandbars and mud flats. Dozens of small islands scattered across the water, most of them barely above sea level at high tide. Marshes that flood and drain with the lunar cycle. It's a landscape that seems designed to be useless to human habitation. And that's precisely what made it valuable to people fleeing the Huns. An army on horseback can't cross shallow water filled with unpredictable channels. Supply wagons can't navigate marshland. The very things that made the lagoon seem worthless, the mud, the water, the isolation, made it a refuge. So they came, not in one great migration, but in waves, family by family, boat by boat. People from Aquileia brought whatever they could carry, tools, seeds, sacred objects from their churches, coins if they had any, jewellery, anything portable and valuable. People from Padua brought different things, different skills, different hopes. They came from Altinum, from Concordia, from a dozen cities and towns, and they scattered across the lagoon island, setting up temporary camps that would, against all expectation, become permanent. Those first years must have been desperately hard. These were city people, used to stone buildings and paved streets and markets and theatres. Now they were living in temporary shelters on muddy islands. There were no fields to plant. The islands were too small, too salty, too frequently flooded. There were no forests to harvest. There was just water and mud, and the fish in the lagoon, and the salt that could be harvested when seawater evaporated in the sun. But fish and salt, it turned out, were enough. The people who had fled to the lagoon discovered that while they couldn't grow grain, the people on the mainland still needed fish and salt. Salt was essential for preserving food, and in a time without refrigeration, that made it valuable. Fish was protein, and protein was always in demand. So the first Venetians became fishermen and salt makers, trading their catch and their salt for grain and wine and oil and everything else they needed. This is where Venice begins, not with banking or trade routes or merchant princes, but with simple exchange. Fish for bread, salt for wine, the most basic form of commerce born of necessity. The refugees in the lagoon had no choice but to trade because they couldn't be self-sufficient. Geography forced them to become merchants almost from the beginning. They also had to become boat builders. On the mainland, you could walk from place to place, ride a horse, drive a cart. In the lagoon, every journey required a boat. Going to fish required a boat. Trading your salt required a boat. Visiting your neighbour on the next island required a boat. So the Venetians learned to build boats, small ones at first, simple fishing craft, but gradually more sophisticated vessels as their skills developed and their needs expanded. The geography that had saved them from the Huns shaped everything about their emerging culture. They thought in terms of tides and channels. They measured distances in how long it took to row, not to walk. They built their houses on wooden pilings driven deep into the mud, learning through trial and error how to create stable foundations in unstable ground. Every building was an act of faith that the pilings would hold, that the next high tide wouldn't wash everything away, and slowly, stubbornly, impossibly, the temporary camps became villages. Families who had thought they would return to their mainland cities once the danger passed began to realise they weren't going back. The cities they'd fled from were destroyed or fundamentally changed. A new generation was being born in the lagoon, children who had never known life on solid ground, who were as comfortable in boats as their grandparents had been on paved streets. By the late 5th century, by 500 or so, the Huns were gone. Attila had died, his empire had fractured, and the immediate threat had passed. But new threats replaced it. Lombards, Goths, various Germanic tribes fighting over the corpse of the Western Roman Empire. The mainland remained dangerous, unstable, a place of constant warfare. The lagoon, meanwhile, remained peaceful, isolated, protected by water. The people in the lagoon maintained connection with the one piece of the Roman Empire that survived, Byzantium, the Eastern Empire with its capital at Constantinople. While the Western Empire had fallen, the Eastern Empire endured, and it claimed authority over all the old Roman territories, including the Italian coast. The lagoon dwellers declared themselves loyal subjects of the Byzantine emperor. This wasn't just political posturing, it was practical. Byzantine protection, however distant, was better than no protection at all. Byzantine gold coins were the most reliable currency in a world where money itself was becoming uncertain. This Byzantine connection would shape Venice's future in profound ways. It oriented the city eastward, toward Constantinople and beyond, toward the trade routes that connected Europe to Asia. While the rest of Western Europe was fragmenting into isolated, localized economies, the people in the lagoon maintained connections to the wider world of Mediterranean trade. In 697, a significant moment occurred. The scattered island communities, recognizing their shared interests, came together and elected a dux, a leader. In the Venetian dialect, this would become Doge. The first Doge was supposedly a man named Paoluccio Anafesto, though historians debate whether he really existed or is legendary. What matters is not whether he was real, but what his election represented. The lagoon community is beginning to think of themselves as a single entity, as something that would eventually become Venice. The office of Doge was strange and unique. He was elected, not hereditary, but elected for life. He had significant power but was constrained by councils and assemblies. He wore Byzantine-style robes and was treated with elaborate ceremony, but he was ultimately a servant of the merchant families who elected him. This balance between individual power and collective control, between honouring the leader and limiting his authority, would characterise Venetian government for centuries. By the year 700, by the 8th century, the settlement in the lagoon had evolved from refugee camp to something recognisably urban. There were churches now, built in Byzantine style with domed roofs and elaborate mosaics. There were warehouses for storing salt and fish. There were boat-building yards. The population had grown as more people from the mainland, seeing the relative safety and prosperity of the lagoon, chose to move there. The Venetians were still, at this point, small players in Mediterranean trade. Byzantine merchants dominated the eastern routes. Arab traders controlled much of the southern Mediterranean. Amalfi and other Italian ports had their own networks. Venice was provincial, marginal, focused primarily on the local trade in fish and salt. But they were learning. Every Byzantine merchant who stopped in the lagoon to trade was a teacher, demonstrating how long-distance commerce worked. Every transaction was a lesson in currency exchange, in assessing value, in negotiating terms. The Venetians had certain advantages they were beginning to understand. Their location at the head of the Adriatic meant they were ideally positioned to trade between the Mediterranean and Central Europe. Rivers flowing down from the Alps provided routes inland. Ships coming from Constantinople or Alexandria, or anywhere else in the eastern Mediterranean, would naturally pass near Venice. The city was becoming a crossroads almost by accident of geography. They also had the advantage of necessity. Because they couldn't grow food, they had to trade. This made them think constantly about markets, about what people wanted and needed, about how to add value. A city that could feed itself might be self-satisfied, insular. A city that depended entirely on trade for survival had to stay sharp, stay innovative, stay connected to the wider world. And they had the advantage of their origins, having lost everything once, having started from nothing in the mud. They had less to lose than established cities. They could take risks that others wouldn't. They could try new approaches. If a trading voyage failed, well, they'd survived worse. If a new method of doing business didn't work, they'd try something else. This combination of desperation and flexibility, of caution born from experience and boldness born from necessity, would characterize the Venetian approach to commerce for centuries. By 800, by the time Charlemagne was crowned emperor in the West, and a new European order was emerging, Venice had been in the lagoon for nearly 4 centuries. The temporary refuge had become permanent home. The desperate refugees had become skilled mariners and shrewd traders. The mud and salt water had become the foundation of something extraordinary, though no one yet understood quite how extraordinary it would be. The children born in the lagoon in 800 had grandparents who could remember the old stories, the tales of the flight from the Huns, the hardship of those first years. But those were stories now, not living memory. The present was boats and fish and salt and the growing web of trade connections that would, in time, make Venice wealthy beyond measure. The future? Well, the future was unimaginable, which was precisely what made it possible. In the mud, in the water, in the very margins of the civilized world, something new was being born. Not yet banking, not yet wealth, just survival and trade. And the slow accumulation of knowledge about how to turn necessity into opportunity. The story was beginning. Let it settle in your mind as we pause here, in the quiet of the lagoon, 800 years into the Common Era, with so much still to come. By the 9th century, something was changing in the lagoon. The fishermen and salt makers were becoming something else, something more ambitious. They were becoming merchants. And the difference mattered more than you might think. A fisherman catches fish and sells them locally. A salt maker produces salt and trades it for bread. These are simple, direct transactions. But a merchant does something more complex. A merchant buys goods in one place and sells them in another, profiting from the difference. A merchant thinks about markets, about what's scarce here and abundant there, about how to move goods across distances. A merchant needs to understand not just one community but many, not just today's prices but tomorrow's possibilities. The Venetians were becoming merchants almost without intending to. It started simply enough. A Venetian boat captain, having sold his load of salt in Ravenna or some other mainland port, might notice that olive oil was cheap there because the harvest had been good. He might buy some oil with his salt profits and bring it back to Venice, where oil was always expensive because it had to be imported. Sell the oil for a profit, use that profit to buy more salt, sail back to Ravenna, repeat. Each trip, a little more wealth. Each trip, a little more understanding of how trade worked. By the late 800s, by the latter part of the 9th century, Venetian ships were venturing further. Not just up and down the Adriatic coast, but south to Byzantine territories in Greece, to Constantinople itself, that magnificent city that was still the wealthiest metropolis in Christendom. The journey was long and dangerous. Storms could sink ships. Pirates prowled the sea lanes. Foreign ports might be hostile. But the potential rewards made the risks worthwhile. Think about what it meant to sail to Constantinople in, say, 850. You're leaving the familiar lagoon, venturing out into the Adriatic, then down along the Dalmatian coast, threading through Greek islands, finally arriving at the great city on the Bosphorus. The voyage might take weeks. During that time, you're vulnerable to weather, to accident, to robbery. Your entire investment, the goods you're carrying, the ship itself, the wages you've promised your crew, all of it is at risk. But if you succeed, if you reach Constantinople and sell your goods and buy new cargo and make it home safely, the profits could be extraordinary. Byzantine merchants would pay good prices for amber from the north, for furs, for slaves captured in wars along the European frontier, and Constantinople had goods that Europeans desperately wanted. Silk from China, spices from India and Southeast Asia, glassware, fine textiles, works of art. Bring those goods back to Venice, sell them to merchants heading north into Europe, and you could multiply your initial investment several times over. This kind of long-distance trade created problems that simple fishing had never presented. The first problem was capital. A trading voyage required significant upfront investment. You needed a ship, which was expensive. You needed cargo to sell, which meant having money to buy goods before you could sell them. You needed provisions for the crew, wages for the sailors, money to pay port fees. If you were a fisherman with a small boat and modest savings, how could you possibly afford to become a long-distance merchant? The Venetians, practical as always, invented a solution. They called it the colleganza, and later variations would be called Commenda. Here's how it worked. Imagine you're a wealthy Venetian. Maybe you inherited money, or maybe you've already made successful voyages and accumulated capital. You have money, but perhaps you're getting older, or you have other business to attend to, or you simply don't want to risk your own life on a dangerous voyage. Meanwhile, there's a younger man who has skill as a sailor and trader, who knows the routes and the markets, but who lacks capital. You make an agreement. You provide the capital, say, 100 gold bezants, the Byzantine coins that were the most reliable currency of the era. The young man takes this money, uses it to buy cargo or outfit a ship, makes the voyage, conducts the trade, and returns. When he returns, the profits are divided. Typically, the investor who provided the capital would receive 3/4 of the profit, while the travelling merchant who did the actual work would receive 1/4. Think about what this arrangement accomplished. The wealthy investor spread his risk. Instead of putting all his money into one voyage, he could invest in multiple voyages with different merchants going to different destinations. If one voyage failed, others might succeed. The travelling merchant, meanwhile, got access to capital he could never have accumulated on his own, and he got to keep a significant portion of the profits. If the voyage was successful, both parties won. This was an early form of what we'd now call venture capital, or limited partnership. The investor was risking money, but limiting that risk to the amount invested. He wasn't personally liable for debts the travelling merchant might incur. The travelling merchant was risking his life and labour, but wasn't risking capital he didn't have. Risk was distributed, opportunity was created, and trade expanded beyond what any individual could have accomplished alone. The Colleganza contracts were written down, witnessed, formalised. Venetian notaries developed standard forms for these agreements. A culture of documentation was emerging. In a world where most business was done on a handshake, where most people couldn't read or write, the Venetians were creating written records, legal frameworks, enforceable contracts. This wasn't because they were especially honest or especially dishonest. It was because the stakes were high and the distances were great. When a merchant sailed to Constantinople and wouldn't return for months, you needed written proof of the agreement. Memory wasn't enough. Trust wasn't enough. You needed documents. As the 9th century turned into the 10th, as we move into the 900s and then toward the year 1000, Venice was becoming genuinely prosperous. The evidence was visible. Churches were rebuilt in more elaborate style. The great Basilica of San Marco was being constructed, with gold mosaics and marble pillars looted from, or, more politely, acquired from Byzantine sites. The Doge's palace was expanded. Wealthy merchants were building stone houses instead of wooden ones. But the real transformation came in 1096 with the First Crusade. Pope Urban II called for Christian warriors to march to the Holy Land and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of knights and common soldiers from every corner of Western Europe pledged to take the cross and journey to Jerusalem. Now these crusaders faced an obvious problem. Jerusalem was very far away. You could march overland through the Byzantine Empire and down into Syria and Palestine, but that would take years and require passing through potentially hostile territory. Or you could sail, which was faster but required ships. Lots of ships. The Venetians saw opportunity. They had ships. They had experience sailing to the eastern Mediterranean. They could transport crusaders, but they weren't going to do it for free or for heavenly reward alone. They negotiated contracts. A crusader knight would pay a fixed sum for passage, so much per man, so much per horse, so much per ton of equipment. Food for the voyage cost extra. The Venetians drove hard bargains, and the crusaders, desperate for transport, paid. Imagine the scene at Venice in 1096 and 1097 as the crusaders gathered. Thousands of armed men crowding the quays, their horses nervous in unfamiliar surroundings, mountains of equipment and supplies being loaded onto Venetian ships. The Venetians organising it all with characteristic efficiency, counting passengers, collecting fees, calculating how much food and water would be needed, assigning ships, setting schedules. It must have been chaos. But it was profitable chaos. The Venetians didn't just transport crusaders, they established permanent trading posts in the cities the crusaders conquered. When the crusaders took Antioch and Jerusalem and other cities, Venetian merchants negotiated for quarters in these cities, districts where Venetian traders could live and conduct business. These quarters had their own warehouses, their own churches, their own governance. They were pieces of Venice transplanted to the Levant. This is where long-distance trade became systematized. A Venetian merchant in Venice would send goods east to the Venetian quarter in Acre or Tyre or Antioch. His agent there, possibly a family member, possibly a partner, would sell the goods and buy local products. These might be sent further east to Damascus or Baghdad or even to Alexandria in Egypt, where yet another network of agents and partners waited. Goods would travel through multiple hands, across multiple markets, each transaction documented, each transfer recorded. The financial complexity of this trade was extraordinary. Imagine you're a Venetian merchant coordinating a trade that involves Venice, Acre, Damascus, and Alexandria. You need to track goods moving through all these cities. You need to know what's sold for what price, what the current market rates are, what your profits or losses are. You need to move money between these cities. But actually transporting gold or silver is dangerous and expensive. This is where bills of exchange began to develop. The basic idea was simple but brilliant. Instead of physically moving money, you moved promises. A merchant in Venice who owed money to a merchant in Damascus would write a letter instructing his agent in Damascus to pay the debt. The letter itself became a valuable document. It could be sold or traded or used to settle other debts. Money could move at the speed of a ship carrying letters rather than requiring slow, dangerous transport of actual coins. Currency exchange became a specialized skill. Every city minted its own coins. Byzantine byzants, Venetian ducats, Muslim dinars, French livres, German thalers. A merchant might encounter dozens of different currencies. Each had a different weight of gold or silver. Each might be debased or pure. Exchange rates fluctuated based on supply and demand. Knowing the true value of different coins, being able to quickly calculate fair exchange rates, became essential expertise. The Venetians developed a reputation for honesty in these exchanges, which was good for business. If you were a Crusader knight who needed to exchange your French coins for local currency to buy supplies, you'd rather deal with a Venetian money changer who had a reputation to protect than with a local operator who might never see you again. Trust was valuable. Reputation was valuable. The Venetians understood this instinctively. Insurance was beginning to emerge as well, though in primitive forms. A merchant might spread his goods across multiple ships rather than putting everything on one vessel. If pirates captured one ship, the others might get through. Or several merchants might form an association agreeing to share losses. If one member lost a ship, the others would contribute to cover part of the loss. These were informal arrangements, not yet the systematic insurance industry that would develop later, but they showed the Venetian instinct for managing risk. The Rialto, a cluster of islands near the centre of what would become Venice, was developing as the commercial heart of the city. Money changers set up tables there. Merchants gathered to negotiate deals. Ship captains looked for cargo. Investors looked for promising voyages to fund. Information was exchanged as freely as goods. News about market conditions in Constantinople. Rumours about pirate activity. Word about which routes were safe and which were dangerous. The Rialto was becoming what it would remain for centuries, the beating heart of Venetian commerce. By 1100, by the end of the 11th century, Venice had transformed completely from its humble origins. The population had grown to perhaps 30,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. The government was becoming more sophisticated, with councils and assemblies balancing the Doge's power. The merchant families who profited most from the expanding trade were becoming a distinct class, an oligarchy of wealth that would eventually formalize their control. The ships in the harbour were larger and more numerous than they'd been a century before. The arsenal, the shipyard where Venice built its vessels, was expanding to meet demand. Trade routes now extended from England in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Venetian merchants were everywhere. speaking multiple languages, adapting to different cultures, always looking for the next opportunity. The financial innovations emerging from this trade were changing how business worked. The Commenda contracts were being refined and standardized. Currency exchange was becoming more sophisticated. Letters of credit were developing. Account books were being kept with increasing care and detail. None of this was revolutionary in itself. Other cities were developing similar practices. But Venice was synthesizing these innovations, perfecting them, making them routine rather than exceptional. And yet, for all this growth and sophistication, Venice in 1100 was still not the dominant power it would become. Genoa was a serious rival, competing for many of the same trade routes. Pisa was strong. The Byzantine Empire still controlled much of the eastern trade directly. Venice was successful, yes, but not supreme. Not yet. What would change that, what would propel Venice to dominance, would be one of the most controversial episodes in medieval history, the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople. But that story awaits us. For now, picture Venice at the turn of the 12th century. Ships coming and going, merchants calculating profits, money changers at their tables on the Rialto, notaries writing contracts, the whole city humming with commerce, with ambition, with the restless energy of people who had come from nothing and were determined to become everything. The foundations of banking were being laid, transaction by transaction, innovation by innovation, in a city built on mud that was becoming built on gold. The 12th century unfolded with Venice growing steadily richer and more powerful. Trade continued to expand. The Commenda contracts became so routine that young men planning their careers could reasonably expect to make several trading voyages, accumulating capital with each successful journey, eventually becoming investors themselves rather than travelling merchants. It was becoming a system, a pathway from modest beginnings to substantial wealth, and the Venetian merchant families were mastering it. But wealth creates its own complications. As Venetian merchants became richer, they became more invested in the stability of trade routes, more concerned about competition, more interested in securing advantages. The relationship with the Byzantine Empire was particularly important. Constantinople was the gateway to the East, the great marketplace where European goods met Asian luxuries. Byzantine emperors granted Venetian merchants special privileges, reduced tariffs, permission to maintain their own quarter in the city, legal protections. These privileges were enormously valuable, and the Venetians guarded them jealously. By 1200, by the turn of the 13th century, Venice was at a crossroads. The city was prosperous but faced challenges. Genoa was an aggressive rival, winning contracts the Venetians wanted, establishing their own trading posts in competition with Venetian quarters. The Byzantine Empire, while still important to Venetian trade, was weakening, plagued by internal disputes and external threats. The Muslim powers controlling much of the eastern Mediterranean were sometimes cooperative trading partners, sometimes hostile obstacles. Venice needed something to secure its position, to gain an overwhelming advantage. That something arrived in the form of the Fourth Crusade. In 1202, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade to reclaim Jerusalem, which had been retaken by Muslim forces. The response was enthusiastic. Thousands of French and German knights took crusading vows, but they faced the same problem earlier crusaders had faced: how to get to the Holy Land. The answer, as before, seemed to be Venice. The crusade leaders sent envoys to Venice to negotiate transport. The Doge at this time was Enrico Dandolo, a man already in his 80s or possibly his 90s, sources differ, and blind, though whether from birth, disease or injury is unclear. Don't let his age or blindness fool you into thinking he was weak or passive. Dandolo was sharp, ruthless, and absolutely committed to Venetian interests. When the Crusader envoys arrived, he saw opportunity. The negotiations were complex. The Crusaders wanted transport for 33,500 men, 4,500 horses, and vast quantities of equipment and supplies. This was an enormous undertaking. Venice would need to build new ships, dedicate much of its maritime capacity to the Crusade, and delay other profitable trading voyages. Dandolo agreed to provide the transport, but at a price: 85,000 silver marks, an astronomical sum. The Crusaders agreed, believing they could raise the money through donations and taxes in their home territories. The contract was signed in 1201, and Venice began building the fleet. The arsenal worked at capacity. Hundreds of ships were constructed or refitted. Supplies were gathered. Venice was committed. But when the Crusaders began gathering in Venice in the summer of 1202, a problem became apparent. Far fewer Crusaders had arrived than expected. Perhaps 12,000 instead of the promised 33,000, and they hadn't brought enough money. They could pay only about 51,000 marks of the 85,000 they owed. Venice had already spent enormous resources preparing for the Crusade and now faced a massive shortfall. Dandolo, faced with Crusaders who couldn't pay their debts, made them an offer. Venice would defer payment if the Crusaders would help Venice with a small matter first. The city of Zara, on the Dalmatian coast, had rebelled against Venetian control and placed itself under Hungarian protection. Help Venice retake Zara, Dandolo proposed, and the debt could be renegotiated. The Crusaders were trapped. They couldn't pay what they owed. They couldn't afford to hire ships elsewhere. Many had sold everything they owned to finance their crusading vows and couldn't simply go home. So despite the uncomfortable fact that Zara was a Christian city and they were supposedly crusading against Muslims, they agreed. In November 1202, the Crusade fleet sailed not toward the Holy Land but toward Zara, besieged it, and captured it for Venice. Pope Innocent was furious and excommunicated everyone involved, though he later quietly lifted the excommunication for the Crusaders, while maintaining it for the Venetians. But Dandolo had achieved his immediate goal. Zara was back under Venetian control. The Crusade, however, was now even more deeply in debt to Venice and still no closer to Jerusalem. Then came another proposal, this one even more audacious. Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince whose father had been deposed and blinded, approached the Crusade leaders. He promised that if they would help him take the throne of Constantinople, he would pay them handsomely, 200,000 silver marks, and provide troops and supplies for the crusade to Egypt and then Jerusalem. He would also reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches under papal authority, ending the schism that had divided Christianity for a century and a half. It was an attractive offer, at least on the surface. The Crusaders would get the money they needed, the support they needed, and accomplish a religious goal the papacy had long desired. Dandolo, calculating quickly, saw something even more valuable. A grateful Byzantine emperor, dependent on Venice for his throne, would grant Venetian merchants unprecedented trading privileges. Constantinople's wealth would be even more accessible to Venetian commerce. So in the spring of 1203, the Crusade fleet sailed to Constantinople. After various complications and battles, Alexios was indeed placed on the throne alongside his father, who had been released from prison. But Alexios discovered he couldn't deliver on his promises. The Byzantine treasury didn't have the money he'd pledged. The Orthodox clergy refused to accept papal authority. The population of Constantinople, humiliated by having an emperor imposed on them by foreign crusaders, was hostile. By January 1204, the situation had deteriorated completely. A palace coup overthrew Alexios and his father. Both were murdered. A new emperor, Alexios V Mourtzouphlos, took power and made clear he would not honour any agreements with the Crusaders. The Crusade was now stuck outside Constantinople with no money, no supplies, and no way forward. Dandolo proposed what many had probably been contemplating all along: take Constantinople itself, divide its wealth among the Crusaders and Venetians. The city was Christian, yes, but the Crusaders told themselves they were punishing Constantinople for breaking faith, for murdering the rightful emperor, for refusing to submit to Rome. These justifications were thin, but men who have come so far and sacrificed so much or find justifications if they need them. In April 1204, the Crusade fleet attacked Constantinople. The assault was fierce. The Venetian ships, specially fitted with scaling ladders, approached the city's sea walls. The ancient walls had protected Constantinople for centuries, had turned back countless attacks. But Venetian maritime skill made the difference. Ships drew alongside the walls. Soldiers scrambled up ladders. The sea gate was forced open. What followed was one of the great catastrophes of medieval history. Constantinople was sacked with a thoroughness and brutality that shocked even that violent age. The Crusaders and Venetians rampaged through the city for 3 days. Churches were looted, libraries were burned, precious relics accumulated over 1,000. Years were destroyed or stolen. Women were raped. Citizens were killed. The great city that had preserved classical learning, that had stood as a bastion of civilization, was devastated. The material wealth that flowed back to Venice was staggering. Gold, silver, jewels, fine textiles, religious relics. Works of art, shipload after shipload of treasure arrived in the lagoon. The most visible symbols of this plunder still stand in Venice today. The 4 great bronze horses that now adorn the facade of San Marco were taken from the Hippodrome in Constantinople. They had originally been made in classical Greece or Rome, had stood in Constantinople for centuries, and now became Venetian trophies. Inside San Marco, you can still see Byzantine mosaics and precious stones looted in 1204. The treaty dividing the spoils gave Venice 3/8 of Constantinople itself and 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire. Venetian merchants gained complete freedom from tariffs throughout what remained of Byzantine territory. The Venetian quarter in Constantinople expanded enormously. Venice effectively controlled access to the Black Sea and the eastern trade routes. No rival, not Genoa, not Pisa, not anyone, could compete with these advantages. Think about what this meant financially. Before 1204, Venice was one of several Italian maritime cities competing for eastern trade. After 1204, Venice had a near monopoly on the most profitable routes. Venetian merchants didn't just have trading posts in the east, they effectively owned portions of the empire. Profits that had been substantial became extraordinary. This flood of wealth created new banking needs. Merchants who had operated with modest capital now had huge sums to manage. Families that had been prosperous became genuinely rich. This wealth needed to be invested, protected, grown. Simply keeping money in a strongbox was wasteful when it could be loaned out at interest, though the church's prohibition on usury made this complicated, or invested in new trading ventures. The moral weight of how this wealth was acquired was something Venetians dealt with in various ways. Some endowed churches and monasteries, perhaps hoping to buy forgiveness for sins. The wealth looted from Constantinople's churches was used to beautify Venice's churches. A kind of spiritual laundering. Dandolo himself died in Constantinople in 1205 and was buried in Hagia Sophia, the great church that had been the spiritual centre of Orthodox Christianity. His tomb remained there for centuries, a permanent reminder of Venice's triumph and Constantinople's humiliation. Others simply rationalised. Constantinople had broken faith. The Greeks were schismatics. The city's wealth was being put to better use in Venetian hands. These justifications sound hollow now, and they probably sounded hollow even then to those who examined them closely. But humans are very good at justifying actions that benefit them, especially when everyone around them is doing the same thing. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. It never fought a single battle against Muslim forces. It was, from a religious perspective, a complete failure and a scandal. But from a Venetian economic perspective, it was the greatest success imaginable. It secured Venice's commercial dominance for the next 2 centuries. It flooded the city with capital that could be reinvested in ever larger trading ventures. It demonstrated that Venice would pursue its interests ruthlessly. that the city's merchants were not constrained by conventional morality when profit was at stake. This moment, the sack of Constantinople in 1204, marks a turning point. Before it, Venice was a successful trading city among others. After it, Venice was the dominant commercial and financial power in the Mediterranean. The banking practices that had been developing for 2 centuries accelerated dramatically. With more capital available, larger loans were possible. With guaranteed access to Eastern markets, long-term commercial planning became feasible. With treasure flowing in, the question became not whether to invest, but how best to invest, which ventures would yield the highest returns, how to manage risk when dealing with such enormous sums. The Venetian banking families, we'll meet them properly soon, emerged from the Fourth Crusade transformed. Their wealth increased by orders of magnitude. Their confidence grew accordingly. They began to think of themselves not merely as merchants or moneylenders, but as financial powers, as people whose decisions could shape kingdoms, whose loans could finance wars, whose investments could determine which businesses succeeded and which failed. Constantinople would eventually recover somewhat, though it never regained its former glory. The Crusaders established a Latin empire that lasted until 1261, when Byzantine Greeks retook the city. But the damage was done. The empire was permanently weakened, fragmented. Venice's commercial advantages once gained were not easily lost. Even after the Greeks returned, Venetian merchants retained significant privileges and presence. Let the weight of this moment settle. A crusade that was supposed to reclaim Jerusalem instead destroyed the greatest Christian city in the East. A religious endeavour became an economic conquest. Thousands died. An ancient civilization was devastated, and Venice became rich beyond the dreams of those refugees who had fled into the lagoon 800 years earlier, fleeing barbarians seeking only to survive. Now their descendants had themselves become a kind of barbarian, dressed in fine silks, justified by complex rationalizations, but fundamentally taking by force what they wanted. The transformation was complete. Venice had arrived as a financial power, built on salt and fish and mud and trade, and now on the shattered stones of Constantinople. The banking capital of the medieval world was emerging from the ruins of another city's catastrophe. The wealth that flowed into Venice after 1204 created a problem that might seem enviable, but was nonetheless real. What do you do with so much money? For a merchant family that had operated with, say, 500 gold ducats in capital, suddenly having 5,000 ducats or 50,000 ducats required a completely different approach to business. You couldn't just keep it in a chest in your house. That was dangerous and wasteful. You couldn't spend it all. There simply weren't enough luxuries to buy. The money needed to work, to generate more money, to be put to productive use. And that meant banking needed to become more sophisticated, more systematic, more of a profession in itself rather than just a sideline to trading. Let's walk through a day in the life of a Venetian banker in, say, 1250, the middle of the 13th century. Our banker, let's call him Giacomo Soranzo, a member of one of the great merchant families, wakes before dawn in his stone house on the Grand Canal. The house itself is a statement of wealth. Stone construction, not wood, multiple stories, windows of actual glass, not just shutters. Inside, the furnishings demonstrate his success. Byzantine carpets, carved furniture, silver candlesticks, fine linens. His wife's jewellery box contains gems from India. His account books, kept on parchment that cost more than most people earned in a month, record transactions spanning from London to Alexandria. After prayers and a breakfast of fresh bread, cheese and watered wine, Giacomo rows himself. Wealthy Venetians still rowed their own boats. It was simply what you did in Venice, to the Rialto. The Rialto had evolved into the commercial heart of the city. Technically, it was a cluster of islands connected by bridges, but functionally it was the place where business happened. By the time Giacomo arrives, the area is already crowded. Ship captains are looking for cargo. Merchants are negotiating over samples of silk and spices. Money changers have set up their tables, the precious scales and weights laid out carefully, ready for the day's business. Giacomo's table is near the centre of the action, a position earned by his family's reputation and secured by the rent he pays to the state. On the table sits an account book, an abacus for calculations, scales for weighing coins, and small stacks of different currencies. There's also a lockbox containing various letters of credit and bills of exchange, documents that represent money without actually being money, promises that have value because Giacomo's reputation makes them trustworthy. The first customer of the day is a French merchant who has just arrived from Champagne with a load of wool. He needs to convert his French livre into Venetian currency to buy passage home and pay his local expenses. This seems simple, just exchange one currency for another, but it's actually quite complex. The French livres are silver coins, but their silver content varies depending on when they were minted and which French territory minted them. Some are nearly pure silver. Others have been debased, mixed with copper to stretch the supply. Giacomo examines the coins carefully, weighs a sample, consults a chart he keeps that lists the current exchange rates for various currencies. The rate he offers reflects several factors, the actual silver content of the French coins, obviously, but also supply and demand. If many French merchants have been arriving recently, there's more French currency in Venice than usual, so it's worth less. The rate also includes Giacomo's profit, typically a few %. And it incorporates risk. If the French coins turn out to be more debased than they appear, Giacomo will lose money. The French merchant, experienced in these transactions, negotiates briefly but accepts the rate. It's fair, or fair enough, and Giacomo's reputation means the exchange will be honest. They complete the transaction. Giacomo gives him Venetian ducats and grossi, makes an entry in his account book recording the exchange. The next customer is a Venetian merchant about to depart for Constantinople. He needs to carry funds to buy silk and spices, but carrying actual gold coins is dangerous. Pirates are common, ships sink in storms, bandits rob travellers on land. Losing the coins would mean losing everything. So Giacomo offers an alternative, a letter of credit. Here's how it works. The Venetian merchant gives Giacomo 3,000 gold ducats. Giacomo writes a letter addressed to his business associate in Constantinople, possibly a family member, possibly a trusted partner, instructing this associate to pay 3,000 ducats to the bearer of the letter. The letter is dated, sealed with Giacomo's seal, and witnessed by another merchant. The travelling merchant now has a piece of parchment instead of a heavy, dangerous pile of gold. When he arrives in Constantinople, he presents the letter to Giacomo's associate, who verifies the seal and signature and pays out the money. For this service, Giacomo charges a fee, perhaps 2% of the amount, 60 ducats for the convenience and security of not carrying gold. The fee seems small, but if Giacomo handles dozens of such transactions monthly, the fees accumulate significantly. And there's another advantage for Giacomo. He now has 3,000 ducats to use for several months until his associate in Constantinople pays out the letter of credit. He can lend that money to someone else, invest it in a trading voyage, use it productively. Money, in the hands of a skilled banker, could be in multiple places at once through this system of letters and promises. By mid-morning, a more complex situation arrives. A group of merchants wants to fund a trading voyage to Alexandria, but none of them has enough capital alone. They want Giacomo to organise a colleganza contract. There will be 5 investors, each contributing different amounts. The ship captain will take the voyage, but is also investing some of his own money. They need to determine how profits will be divided, what happens if the voyage fails, who bears what risks. Giacomo acts as facilitator and notary. He helps them negotiate terms. The investors will contribute a total of 8,000 ducats. The ship captain contributes 2,000 of his own money and his labour. If the voyage succeeds, profits will be divided. Investors receive 3/4 proportional to their investment. The captain receives 1/4 plus his proportional share as an investor. If the voyage fails completely, the ship sinks, The cargo is seized, the captain dies. The investors lose their money but have no further liability. The captain's heirs, if he dies, have no obligation to repay the investors. Giacomo writes this all down carefully. The contract is witnessed by 3 merchants who happen to be at the Rialto. Each investor and the captain makes his mark or signature. Giacomo keeps a copy in his records. For this service he charges a small fee, not a percentage of the investment, but a flat fee for the notary work. The document he's created is legally enforceable. If disputes arise, Venetian courts will refer to this contract. This kind of contract solves a fundamental problem in long-distance trade: how to pool resources and share risk. No single merchant needs to risk everything on one voyage. If you have 10,000 ducats, you might invest 2,000 each in 5 different voyages to 5 different destinations. Some might fail, but if 2 or 3 succeed, you profit overall. Risk is distributed, opportunity is increased. Now comes a delicate matter. A nobleman needs to borrow money. His family owns land on the mainland, valuable agricultural property. But the harvest won't come for months, and he needs money now to pay debts, to fund his daughter's dowry, to maintain his household. He wants to borrow 1,000 ducats to be repaid in 6 months. Here's where Giacomo must navigate carefully. The Catholic Church forbids usury, charging interest on loans. The prohibition is clear and strict. Money is meant to be a medium of exchange, not a commodity that grows of its own accord. Lending money and demanding back more than you lent is, according to church teaching, a sin. Severe sermons condemn usurers. Dante, writing around this time, will place moneylenders in the 7th circle of hell. Venice is a Catholic city. Giacomo goes to Mass. He has no desire to endanger his immortal soul, and yet, lending money for 6 months without compensation makes no economic sense. Giacomo could invest that 1,000 ducats in a trading venture and expect perhaps 20% return. Simply lending it interest-free means losing the opportunity for profit. So medieval bankers, including Giacomo, developed creative solutions to the usury problem. One approach is to frame the loan as a partnership. Giacomo doesn't lend money. He invests in the nobleman's estate. The repayment isn't interest, it's profit sharing. If the nobleman quote _3 1,200 ducats, the extra 200 isn't interest on a loan, but Giacomo's share of the estate's profits. The church might see through this fiction, but it provides enough cover for both parties to maintain that they're not violating usury laws. Another approach involves currency exchange. The nobleman borrows 1,000 Venetian ducats, but promises to repay in Byzantine byzants at a specified exchange rate. The exchange rate Giacomo offers is deliberately unfavourable to the borrower, building the interest into the currency conversion. When the nobleman repays, Giacomo profits from the exchange rate differential. This isn't interest, technically, it's just currency exchange, which is a legitimate business. That the exchange rate happens to heavily favour Giacomo is simply how the market works, or so the argument goes. A third approach is the penalty clause. The loan agreement states that the 1,000 ducats must be repaid in exactly 6 months. However, if repayment is even 1 day late, a penalty applies, perhaps 20 ducats per week of delay. In practice, almost every loan runs slightly quote _4 and the penalty becomes the effective interest. The lender and borrower both understand this is how it works, but the paperwork shows only a loan with a penalty for lateness, not prohibited interest. These workarounds weren't exactly honest, but they allowed commerce to function. Everyone involved, the bankers, the borrowers, the notaries who wrote the contracts, the judges who enforced them, even the priests who condemned usury in principle, understood the reality. Money had time value. Lending carried opportunity cost. Risk deserved compensation. The prohibition on usury was respected in form while being violated in substance, and Venice prospered because of this practical hypocrisy. By afternoon, Giacomo is reviewing his accounts. This is crucial work. In an age before computers, before calculators, before even standardized accounting practices, keeping accurate records required discipline and skill. Giacomo uses what's becoming known as the Venetian method of bookkeeping, an early form of double-entry accounting. Here's how it works. Every transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit, once as a credit. If Giacomo exchanges French livres for Venetian ducats, he records the French coins he received as a debit in one account, and the Venetian coins he paid out as credit in another account. This double recording serves as a check on accuracy. If the debits and credits don't balance, there's an error somewhere. It also provides a clearer picture of financial position. Giacomo can see not just individual transactions, but overall patterns, which currencies he holds too much of, which trading ventures are most profitable, where his money is tied up. The physical books themselves are valuable. Parchment is expensive. The ink is carefully made. Each entry is written clearly in a practiced hand. Giacomo learned bookkeeping as a boy, practicing until his handwriting was neat and consistent. The books are stored securely because they're evidence of debts owed and obligations held. In legal disputes, account books can be presented as evidence. A clear, well-maintained book carries authority. Marine insurance is also developing, though it's still crude compared to what will come later. A merchant shipping valuable cargo might want protection against loss. Several merchants might form an agreement. Each contributes to a common pool, and if any of them loses a ship, the pool compensates the loss. This distributes the risk of any single disaster across many participants. Giacomo participates in several such arrangements. He's part of an association of 30 merchants who have agreed to mutual insurance. Each contributes 100 ducats annually to a common fund managed by trustees. If a member loses a ship, the fund pays up to 3,000 ducats in compensation. The mathematics works because ship losses, while not rare, are also not common. Perhaps one ship in 20 is lost to storms, pirates, or accidents in any given year, with 30 members each making several voyages annually. There's enough money coming in to cover the occasional loss. This is insurance in its infancy, informal, based on trust and reputation rather than formal contracts, limited to members who know each other. But it's solving the same problem that modern insurance addresses, spreading catastrophic risk across many people so that no single person is destroyed by bad luck. As evening approaches, Giacomo tallies his day's work. He's exchanged perhaps 8 different currencies, issued 3 letters of credit, participated in organising 2 Colleganza contracts, arranged 1 loan disguised as a partnership, and updated accounts for a dozen ongoing business relationships. His profit for the day is perhaps 20 ducats, not spectacular but solid, and it accumulates. 20 ducats daily, 6 days weekly, the Sabbath is respected, adds up to over 6,000 ducats annually, and that's just from banking activities, not counting his investments in trading voyages and real estate. The Rialto is clearing now as merchants head home. The money changers are packing up their scales and lockboxes. Ship captains are finalising arrangements. The smell of cooking food drifts from nearby taverns where sailors and merchants gather. Giacomo rows home through the canals, now turning golden in the late afternoon light. At home, his wife has managed the household, their children have studied with tutors, literacy and numeracy are essential for a merchant family, and dinner is being prepared. This is the daily reality of medieval banking in Venice. Not dramatic, not particularly glamorous, but sophisticated in ways that would have been unimaginable 2 centuries earlier. The techniques Giacomo uses, currency exchange, letters of credit, risk pooling, double-entry bookkeeping, creative approaches to the usury prohibition, are laying the groundwork for modern banking. Each innovation solves a practical problem. Each day's transactions, recorded carefully in those precious parchment books, represent the slow accumulation of financial knowledge. The Venetian banking system in the 13th century wasn't perfect. It was built on relationships and reputation, which meant outsiders found it hard to break in. It depended on trust, which meant fraud was possible and sometimes occurred. It worked around religious prohibitions through transparent fictions that everyone pretended to believe. But it worked. It moved money across vast distances. It funded trade that connected Europe to Asia. It allowed people with capital to invest in ventures they couldn't personally undertake. It distributed risk and created opportunity. And it was all happening in the Rialto at tables set up each morning and packed away each evening, conducted by men like Giacomo who understood that money was more than just metal coins, that wealth could be recorded in account books and transmitted through written promises. That time and risk had value that deserved compensation. The mechanics of medieval banking were being perfected, transaction by transaction, day by day, in the financial heart of a city that had learned to turn trade into treasure and treasure into power. Let these details settle in your mind: the scratch of pen on parchment, the weight of gold on scales, the carefully negotiated exchange rates, the contracts binding merchants across oceans. This was how Venice became not just a trading city but a banking capital, mastering the flow of money as surely as its sailors mastered the flow of tides. The merchant families who dominated Venice in the 13th and early 14th centuries understood a fundamental truth. Their wealth depended on the city's power, and the city's power depended on ships. Venice had no land army worth mentioning. The city had no agriculture to feed itself. No iron mines, no forest for timber. Everything Venice had, everything Venice was, flowed from its ability to control the sea, and control of the sea meant having more ships, better ships, and the ability to build ships faster than any rival. This created a problem that private enterprise alone couldn't solve. A merchant family could build ships for its own trading ventures. A group of merchants could pool resources to build a small fleet. But maintaining the hundreds of war galleys needed to protect Venetian trade routes, to fight off pirates, to wage war against Genoa and other rivals, this required resources beyond what any private group could sustain. It required the state itself to become a shipbuilder on an unprecedented scale. The solution was the arsenal, and the arsenal was unlike anything else in the medieval world. If you had visited Venice in, say, 1350 and walked, or more accurately, rode, to the eastern edge of the city, you would have encountered a vast enclosed area surrounded by high brick walls and guard towers. This was the Arsenal, from the Arabic Darsinar, meaning house of industry. The name itself reflected Venice's eastern connections, its willingness to learn from Islamic technology and organization. Pass through the gates, assuming you had permission, which most people didn't, because this was a secure government facility, and you would find yourself in something that looked less like a medieval workshop and more like what we'd recognize as a modern factory. Parallel canals stretched into the distance, each one a construction berth for ships. Vast warehouses stored timber, iron, rope, canvas, pitch, nails, everything needed for shipbuilding. Forges roared with fire, producing anchors and chains and iron fittings. Rope walks stretched hundreds of feet, where workers twisted hemp into cables strong enough to hold a ship in a storm. The scale was staggering. At its height, the arsenal employed perhaps 3,000 workers, an enormous number for a medieval enterprise. These weren't slaves or conscripts, but paid employees of the state, skilled craftsmen who specialized in specific tasks. Some workers did nothing but shape oars, others specialized in caulking seams, still others made sails or forged iron or carved the complex curves of a ship's hull. This specialization allowed for efficiency that would have been impossible if each worker needed to know every aspect of shipbuilding. And the arsenal pioneered something that wouldn't become common for another 400 years, assembly line production. A ship hull would be towed slowly down one of the parallel canals, and at each station along the canal, specialized workers would add components. At the first station, the mast would be installed. At the next, the rigging, then the oars, then the armaments. A galley could be built from keel to launch, ready in a matter of weeks rather than the months it took in a traditional shipyard. In emergency situations, and Venice faced many emergencies, the arsenal could complete a ship in days. This industrial capacity was essential to Venetian power. When war came, as it frequently did, Venice could replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. When Genoa sank 10 Venetian ships, the arsenal built 15. This wasn't just about skill. Though Venetian shipwrights were the best in the Mediterranean, it was about organisation, about systematic production, about the state mobilising resources in ways that private enterprise couldn't match. But building ships cost money, enormous amounts of money. The timber alone represented a significant expense. Venice had no forests of its own and had to import every plank from the mainland or from Dalmatia. A single war galley required perhaps 200 oak trees, carefully selected for the right size and grain. Multiply that by dozens or hundreds of ships, and the timber costs alone were astronomical. Then add the iron, the rope, the canvas, the pitch, the workers' wages, the maintenance of the arsenal itself. The ongoing cost of maintaining a fleet ran into hundreds of thousands of ducats annually. Where would this money come from? Venice had various revenue sources. There were tariffs on trade, though the government kept these relatively low, because high tariffs would drive merchants to rival ports. There were state monopolies. The government controlled the salt trade, for instance, buying salt at fixed prices from producers and selling it at a markup. There were property taxes, though the wealthy families who controlled the government were understandably reluctant to tax themselves too heavily. These revenues helped, but they weren't enough for major expenditures like war or rapid fleet expansion. Venice needed to borrow money, and it needed to borrow from its own citizens. This led to one of the most important financial innovations of the medieval period: government bonds. The system developed gradually through the 13th century and became formalised in the 14th. When the state needed money to build ships, to finance a war, to rebuild after a disaster, it would decree a forced loan called a prestiti. Every citizen above a certain wealth level was required to contribute a specified amount. This wasn't optional. If the state determined you owed 500 ducats, you owed 500 ducats. Refuse and your property could be seized. But Venice offered something in return: interest payments. The state promised to pay 5% annually on the forced loan. If you contributed 500 ducats, you would receive 25 ducats each year, indefinitely. This wasn't usury, or at least it could be argued it wasn't, because the payment was framed as the state sharing revenues with citizens rather than paying interest on a debt. The distinction was thin, but it provided enough theological cover. Even more innovative, these bonds became tradable. Suppose you contributed 500 ducats in a forced loan, but now needed cash. You could sell your right to receive the annual payments to someone else. A market developed. Bond prices fluctuated based on the state's financial health, on whether interest payments were being made reliably, on investor confidence. If Venice was winning a war and trade was booming, bonds might sell above face value. If Venice was losing, or if the treasury was strained, bonds would sell at a discount. This created something remarkable: a secondary market in government debt. Merchants gathered at the Rialto not just to trade spices and silk, but to buy and sell prestiti. There were specialists who did nothing but trade in government bonds, assessing risk, calculating yields, predicting which way bond prices would move. A whole vocabulary developed around bond trading. Investors tracked the Monte, literally __, quote _5, __ the accumulated public debt, and its various issues and tranches. The government established an office called the Monte Vecchio, the Old Mount, to manage the public debt. Clerks kept meticulous records of who owned which bonds, who was entitled to which interest payments. When bonds were sold, the transfer was recorded. Twice yearly, on fixed dates, interest payments were made. Citizens would present documentation proving they owned bonds, and they would receive their payment from the state treasury. The system required significant bureaucratic infrastructure, but Venice developed it because the alternative, being unable to finance military needs, was worse. Think about what this system accomplished. It aligned individual and state interests in a profound way. Every wealthy Venetian, every merchant family, held government bonds. Their personal wealth was directly tied to the state's solvency. If Venice prospered, their bonds would appreciate and interest would be paid reliably. If Venice declined, their bonds would lose value and interest might be suspended. This created powerful incentive for the wealthy to support policies that strengthen the state, to pay taxes when needed, to contribute to defence. It also solved the perennial problem of government finance, how to fund major expenses without the capacity to print money or the ability to tax heavily enough to cover costs immediately. By borrowing from citizens and spreading repayment over decades, Venice could finance wars, build infrastructure, weather crises. The debt never went away, it just accumulated in the Monte. But as long as the economy grew, as long as tax revenues increased, the state could service the debt indefinitely. The grain office was another innovation that blended state power and financial sophistication. Venice, remember, produced no food. Every bushel of wheat, every barrel of wine, every ounce of oil had to be imported. This made the city vulnerable to famine if supply chains were disrupted. War, bad harvests in supplier regions, pirate activity, any of these could threaten the city's food supply. The grain office was established to manage this risk. It was a state agency that purchased grain in bulk from suppliers in Sicily, Egypt, the Black Sea region, anywhere wheat was grown. The office maintained warehouses filled with grain, enough to feed the city for months even if imports stopped. This was strategic food security. But it was also a financial operation. The grain office bought low and sold high, or at least it tried to. When harvests were good and grain was cheap, the office would buy heavily, filling its warehouses. When harvests were poor and grain was expensive, the office would sell from its stores, keeping prices stable in Venice while profiting from the difference. The profits went to the state treasury. In bad years, when the office had to buy expensive grain to feed the city, it might operate at a loss, but the service it provided, preventing famine, preventing social unrest, was worth the cost. Managing the grain office required sophisticated understanding of markets and supply chains. Officials had to track harvests across the Mediterranean, predict supply and demand, coordinate shipping, manage storage to prevent spoilage. They needed working capital to make purchases. Sometimes the grain office itself issued bonds to raise funds for major grain purchases. The operation was complex, blending commercial activity and public service in ways that would have been unthinkable in most medieval societies, where markets and government operated in separate spheres. War drove many of these innovations. Venice fought frequent wars, especially against its great rival Genoa. The two cities competed for control of trade routes, for commercial privileges in foreign ports, for dominance in the Mediterranean. These weren't occasional conflicts, but ongoing strategic competition punctuated by actual warfare. The wars were expensive. Outfitting a war fleet required not just building ships, but arming them, provisioning them, paying crews. Sailors on war galleys earned wages. Soldiers needed equipment. Supplies had to be purchased. A single campaigning season might cost the treasury hundreds of thousands of ducats. A prolonged war could strain even Venice's substantial resources. The War of Chioggia, from 1378 to 1381, was the most serious threat Venice faced in the 14th century. Genoa, allied with Padua and Hungary, attacked Venice itself. Genoese forces actually captured Chioggia, a town at the southern end of the Venetian lagoon, threatening the city directly. For the first and only time in its history, Venice faced the real possibility of military defeat and conquest. The city responded with characteristic determination and organizational skill. The arsenal worked day and night building ships. the government decreed new forced loans, massive prestige that drained citizens' wealth but funded the war effort. Every able man was called to service. Even the wealthy merchant families sent their sons to row galleys and fight. The state promised that anyone who contributed to the war effort, whether money or service, would be compensated if Venice survived. The war was won through a combination of military skill and financial staying power. Venetian forces blockaded Chioggia, trapping the Genoese fleet. The siege lasted months. Both sides suffered terribly. But Venice, with its arsenal producing ships and its sophisticated tax and bond system funding the war, could sustain the effort longer than Genoa could. Eventually Genoa sued for peace. The Treaty of Turin in 1381 ended the war with Venice intact and dominant. But the cost had been staggering. The Monte Vecchio swelled with new debt. Interest payments on bonds consumed a significant portion of state revenue. Some citizens had contributed so much in forced loans that they were essentially impoverished despite nominally owning valuable bonds. The government, recognizing this, sometimes allowed citizens to pay taxes by surrendering bonds at face value, reducing the debt while providing tax relief. The Chioggia War demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Venice's financial system. The ability to mobilize resources through bonds and forced loans had saved the city, but the accumulated debt was a burden that would take generations to reduce. Venice had won the war, but at a cost that would constrain future options. Through all of this, the arsenal's industrial production, the sophisticated bond markets, the state monopolies, the grain office. The war financing, Venice was pioneering approaches to public finance that other states would eventually adopt, but that were revolutionary in the 14th century. The idea that government could systematically borrow from citizens, that debt could be an instrument of state power rather than just a burden, that public and private finance could be integrated through tradable bonds, these concepts would shape the development of modern finance. The workers at the arsenal, hammering and sawing and caulking, were building more than ships. They were building the instruments of state power. The clerks at the Monte Vecchio, recording bond transfers and calculating interest payments, were building more than account books. They were building a system that allowed the state to spend beyond its immediate revenues, to invest in defense and infrastructure, to survive crises that would have destroyed less financially sophisticated societies. By 1400, by the turn of the 15th century, Venice had proven that a city-state with no land, no agriculture, no natural resources except salt water and mud could not only survive but dominate, could defeat larger enemies, could maintain security and prosperity through ships and trade and, crucially, through financial innovation. The banking families had shown how private finance worked. Now the state had shown how public finance worked. And increasingly, the two were intertwined. The same families who traded in spices and silk also traded in government bonds. The same notaries who recorded commercial contracts also recorded bond transfers. The same money changers at the Rialto who exchanged currencies also advised the government on tax policy. Venice had become a financial capital, not just in private banking, but in public finance, not just in moving merchants' money, but in managing the wealth and debt of the state itself. The arsenal's hammers rang day and night, building the wooden walls that protected the city. But equally important were the quills scratching in account books, the seals pressed onto bond certificates, the careful calculations of debt and revenue and risk that allowed Venice to translate financial sophistication into military power and political survival. Let these images rest in your mind. The vast warehouses of the arsenal, the assembly line of ships moving down the canals, the citizens gathered to receive their bond interest, the clerks recording transactions in the Monte Vecchio, all of it working together, public and private finance merging into a system that would sustain Venice through centuries to come. The systems Venice had built, the arsenal, the bond markets, the merchant networks, the sophisticated banking practices, had created a prosperous, stable society by the middle of the 14th century. The city had weathered wars, had defeated its greatest rival Genoa, had secured its trading networks across the Mediterranean and beyond. The population had grown to perhaps 120,000 people, making Venice one of the largest cities in Europe. The merchant families were wealthy beyond the dreams of their great-grandfathers. The future seemed secure. And then, in October 1347, a galley arrived from the Black Sea carrying something invisible in its hold, something that would transform Venice and the entire world in ways no war or economic crisis ever had. The plague had come. The disease that would become known as the Black Death probably originated somewhere in Central Asia, perhaps in the steppes where Mongol armies moved and traded. It travelled along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and soldiers, by fleas on rats, spreading west through caravansaries and port cities. By 1346 it had reached the Crimea. In 1347 it came to Constantinople. And from Constantinople, carried by the very trading ships that had made Venice rich, it came to the lagoon. The first cases appeared in late 1347. People developed strange swellings in their necks, under their arms, in their groins. Dark marks appeared on their skin, hence Black Death. Fever set in. Most who showed symptoms were dead within days. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Someone healthy in the morning might be dead by evening. Whole households were infected simultaneously. The sick were shunned by the healthy, left to die alone or attended only by the desperate or the faithful. By January 1348, the plague was raging through Venice. The death toll was catastrophic. Records from the time are incomplete. Many of those who kept records died, and those who survived were too overwhelmed to write. But historians estimate that somewhere between half and 2/3 of Venice's population died in the 18 months, from late 1347 through early 1349. Think about that proportion. If you knew 10 people, 5 or 6 of them would be dead within a year and a half. Every family lost someone. Most families lost multiple people. Some families were completely extinguished. The economic impact was immediate and multifaceted. Trade stopped first. Ships from infected ports were turned away from healthy ports, and since every port was eventually infected, trade essentially ceased. The fairs in Champagne, where Venetian merchants had sold Eastern goods to Northern Europeans, were cancelled. The overland routes were impassable as cities closed their gates. The sea lanes, normally filled with merchant galleys, became empty. The arsenal continued building ships, but there weren't enough healthy workers. Skilled shipwrights died, taking their knowledge with them. Apprentices who should have learned from masters found the masters dead before the training was complete. The assembly line efficiency that had made the arsenal so productive broke down when half the workers were gone. But let's step back from the horror. And it was horrible, make no mistake, though we're going to focus on the economic dimensions rather than dwelling on the suffering, and think about what happens to an economy when half the population suddenly disappears. Because the effects were complex and sometimes counterintuitive. Labour became scarce almost overnight. Before the plague, Venice had more workers than jobs. Wages were low because if you demanded higher pay, your employer could easily find someone else willing to work for less. Skilled workers earned decent wages, but unskilled labourers earned barely enough to survive. This had been the normal condition for centuries. After the plague, suddenly there were more jobs than workers. Every workshop, every warehouse, every ship needed people, and people were scarce. Workers who had survived could demand higher wages. If an employer refused, they could walk across the Rialto and find another employer desperate for help. Wages doubled, then tripled. Workers who had lived on the edge of starvation before the plague found themselves earning enough to save money, to buy better food, to improve their living conditions. This wage inflation created problems for employers, especially for the merchant families whose businesses depended on hired labour. Your costs had increased dramatically while your revenues had fallen, because trade was disrupted and there were fewer customers. Many businesses failed, but the businesses that survived, that adapted to the new labour market, found they needed to become more efficient. If you couldn't hire 10 workers at low wages, you needed to figure out how to accomplish the same work with 5 workers at high wages. This drove innovation, investment in tools and techniques that increased productivity. Capital, money, goods, property became more valuable relative to labour. Before the plague, a merchant with capital could hire as many workers as needed for very little. After the plague, capital alone wasn't enough. You needed to find scarce workers willing to work for you. This shifted some power from capital to labour, at least temporarily. But it also meant that those who had capital and survived the plague found themselves in strong positions. Inheritance patterns changed dramatically. Consider a merchant family before the plague. A father might have 5 sons, he would train them all in the business, and when he died, his wealth and business would be divided among them. No single son would be particularly wealthy, but each would have enough to start his own career. After the plague, that same father might have only one surviving son. That son would inherit everything, the whole business, all the property, all the wealth. Concentration of wealth in surviving families increased significantly. The banking families, by and large, survived better than the general population. This wasn't because they had better medical knowledge. No one understood what caused the plague or how to prevent it. But wealthy families lived in stone houses that were somewhat less hospitable to rats than the wooden tenements of the poor. They could afford to flee the city, to retire to country estates on the mainland where population density was lower and infection less likely to spread. They had resources to stockpile food and avoid crowded markets. And perhaps most importantly, they had the financial resources to recover after the plague passed. When the plague finally subsided in 1349, not ended because it would return in waves throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, but the first catastrophic outbreak abated, Venice faced enormous challenges. The population had been devastated. Many businesses had failed. Some of the traditional trading partners were equally devastated or worse. The social fabric had been torn. Churches had lost priests. Government had lost officials. Families had lost continuity. But Venice also had advantages that helped it recover faster than many other places. The banking system, while strained, had not collapsed. The merchant families who survived had capital to invest. The bond market continued to function. The Monte Vecchio still paid interest on government bonds, which meant bondholders had income even during the crisis. The arsenal, though working at reduced capacity, could still build ships. The fundamental infrastructure of Venetian commerce, built over centuries, remained intact even though many of the individuals who had operated it were gone. Credit became crucial for recovery. Businesses that had lost owners needed new capital to restart operations. Surviving merchants needed loans to buy goods and restart trade. Property owners needed money to repair buildings that had been neglected during the plague years. The banking families who had capital to lend found enormous demand for credit. Interest rates rose, despite the prohibition on usury. Market reality asserted itself, reflecting the high demand for money and the risk that borrowers might die in a subsequent plague outbreak before repaying. The Venetian government took active steps to aid recovery. Some debts were forgiven or restructured. Regulations that had restricted who could practice certain trades were relaxed. If you could do the work, you could do it, regardless of whether you'd completed a formal apprenticeship. The government offered incentives for people from the mainland to move to Venice to replace the lost population. Tax rates were temporarily reduced to help businesses survive. Trade recovered more slowly than domestic activity. It took time for supply chains to re-establish, for merchant networks to rebuild, for confidence to return. But by 1351, 1352, Venetian ships were once again sailing to Alexandria, to Constantinople, to the Black Sea ports. The merchants who made these early post-plague voyages often reaped enormous profits because goods were scarce and demand was high. The risks were greater. Another plague outbreak could happen at any time, but the rewards compensated for the risk. One of the interesting economic effects was that the surviving population was, on average, wealthier. This seems paradoxical. How could a catastrophe make people wealthier? But consider the mathematics. Before the plague, total wealth in Venice might have been, say, 10 million ducats spread among 120,000 people. After the plague, perhaps 6 million ducats remained. Much had been destroyed or lost, but spread among only 40,000 people. Individual wealth per person increased even though total wealth had decreased. The survivors inherited from the dead. Property that had been divided among many family members was now concentrated in fewer hands. This concentration of wealth had long-term effects. The surviving merchant families became even more dominant. The gap between rich and poor widened even as absolute poverty decreased. Wages were higher, but concentrated wealth created a small elite of extraordinarily rich families who controlled most of the city's capital. This elite would eventually formalize its control through political reforms, but the economic basis was laid during the plague recovery. The demographic collapse also changed consumption patterns. With fewer people, there was less demand for basic necessities like grain. But the survivors, now wealthier on average, wanted luxury goods, fine cloth, spices, works of art, jewellery. Trade shifted somewhat from bulk commodities to high-value luxuries. This played to Venice's strengths. The city had always specialised in the luxury trade: silk, spices, precious stones. The post-plague economy accelerated this specialisation. Agricultural land became less valuable because there were fewer mouths to feed. Urban property, especially commercial property in good locations, became more valuable because trade was becoming concentrated in surviving centres. Venice, as a major commercial hub that had survived and was recovering, attracted investment from across Europe. Merchants who had operated in other cities that were devastated moved to Venice, bringing their capital and expertise. The banking sector consolidated. Smaller banks and money changers who died without heirs simply disappeared. Their businesses were absorbed by larger operators or ceased to exist. The major banking families, the Soranzo, the Corna, the Morosini, names we'll encounter again, survived and expanded. They had the resources to weather the crisis and the capital to take advantage of opportunities during recovery. The plague didn't create these families' dominance, but it certainly accelerated it. Insurance concepts evolved in response to plague risk. Merchants wanted protection not just against ship losses but against death. If a merchant died mid-voyage, what happened to his debts and obligations? Partnership contracts began including clauses addressing death. If one partner died, survivors had the right to buy out his heirs, or debts were reduced or forgiven, or profits were divided differently. These weren't insurance policies in the modern sense, but they showed awareness that death risk needed to be managed contractually. The psychological impact shaped business culture for generations. The generation that survived the plague learned that security was illusory, that wealth could vanish overnight, that tomorrow was uncertain. This made them both more cautious, save money, maintain reserves, don't overextend, and more willing to take risks when opportunities appeared. Life is short, seize the chance while you can. This combination of caution and opportunism characterized Venetian merchants for the next century. By 1360, by 1370, Venice had largely recovered economically, though the population wouldn't return to pre-plague levels for another century. Trade was flowing again. The arsenal was building ships. The bond markets were functioning. New merchant families had risen to replace some that had died out. The city was different, smaller, wealthier on average, more concentrated in power, but it was functioning. Compared to other cities, Venice's recovery was remarkably successful. Florence suffered similarly from plague, but took longer to recover economically. Genoa was devastated and never fully regained its competitive position relative to Venice. Many smaller ports never recovered at all. Venice's advantages, its sophisticated financial system, its diversified trade networks, its government's active intervention, the resilience of its merchant culture allowed it to bounce back faster and stronger. The plague returned in waves, 1363, 1374, 1383, smaller outbreaks that killed thousands, but not the catastrophic percentages of the first outbreak. Venice learned to manage these recurrences. Quarantine practices developed. Ships from infected ports were required to anchor offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, giving us the word quarantine before being allowed into the city. Public health measures became part of government responsibility. These measures didn't prevent plague, but they reduced its impact. The Black Death of 1347 to 1349 was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. But Venice survived it, and in surviving demonstrated the resilience that sophisticated financial systems can provide. Access to capital helped businesses restart. Credit markets helped redistribute resources to where they were needed. The bond system meant government could borrow to fund recovery. Insurance concepts helped manage the new risks. The banking families who had the resources to survive and the knowledge to adapt became even more central to the economy. Let this moment rest in your mind. Venice in 1350, emerging from the worst disaster it would ever face, wounded but recovering, the canals flowing as always, ships beginning to venture out again, the Rialto gradually filling with merchants and bankers, life asserting itself against death, commerce resuming because commerce must resume, people rebuilding because the alternative is despair. The plague had killed hundreds of thousands, but it hadn't killed the city itself, hadn't destroyed the systems and knowledge and networks that made Venice work. Out of catastrophe came transformation, and out of transformation came a Venice that would reach its greatest heights in the century to come. By the early 1400s, Venice had not only recovered from the plague, but had entered what would be remembered as its golden age. The population was growing again, though it wouldn't reach pre-plague levels until well into the 1500s. But if the city was smaller than it had been, it was also richer, more sophisticated, more dominant in Mediterranean trade than ever before. This was Venice at its height, and nowhere was that height more visible than in the city's banking operations. The Rialto had become something extraordinary by the mid-1400s. If you stood on the wooden bridge that crossed the Grand Canal there, the famous stone bridge wouldn't be built until the late 1500s, and looked around, you would see the financial heart not just of Venice, but of Europe itself. Money changers' tables lined the streets. Notaries sat under awnings writing contracts. Merchants from dozens of nations gathered to negotiate. Germans seeking spices, Englishmen selling wool, Arabs offering silk, Greeks with grain, Armenians with gems. Translators moved through the crowds, facilitating deals between people who shared no common language. The noise was constant, dozens of negotiations happening simultaneously, people shouting prices and counteroffers, the scratch of pens on parchment, the clink of coins being weighed on scales. The physical space of the Rialto was relatively small. You could walk from one end to the other in minutes, but the business conducted there reached across the known world. A merchant standing at a table in the Rialto might be arranging a transaction that would involve silk from China being transported to Damascus, then to Venice, then to Bruges, then to London. The paperwork for such a transaction, bills of exchange, letters of credit, partnership contracts, insurance agreements, would be drawn up right there, witnessed by other merchants, sealed and recorded. Venetian banks by 1450 operated on a scale that would have seemed inconceivable a century earlier. The major banking families, Corna, Soranzo, Morosini, Dandolo, Contarini, had correspondents in every significant commercial city in Europe and the Mediterranean. If you were a Corna family banker in Venice, you could write a letter instructing your cousin or agent in London to pay someone, and that letter would be honoured. You could arrange for goods to be purchased in Alexandria and shipped to Venice without ever leaving your table at the Rialto. You could move money from one side of the continent to the other through a series of letters and account transfers, never physically moving a single gold coin. This network of correspondent banking was built on two foundations: trust and accounting. Trust because the system only worked if bankers in different cities honoured each other's letters and instructions. A Venetian banker writing to a London agent was trusting that the agent would act honestly, would keep accurate records, would remit profits. That trust was built over generations. Banking families intermarried, creating literal family ties across distances. They maintained communication through regular letters updating each other on market conditions, exchange rates. Political developments. They sometimes audited each other's books to ensure accuracy. Accounting had become increasingly sophisticated. By the mid-1400s, Venetian bankers were using what we'd recognise as double-entry bookkeeping, though it wasn't yet standardised or formalised. The principle was that every transaction affected at least two accounts. If you received payment, you recorded money coming in as a debit in one account and the obligation fulfilled as a credit in another. This created a self-checking system. If your books balanced, if total debits equaled total credits, you could be reasonably confident your records were accurate. If they didn't balance, you had made an error somewhere and needed to find it. The account books themselves were works of careful craftsmanship. Parchment was still expensive, though paper was beginning to be available as an alternative. The books were bound in leather or wood covered with cloth. Each page was carefully ruled with lines to keep entries neat. Entries were made in ink, black for most transactions, red for important totals or headings. Which is where we get the phrase, quote, 7 for losses. The handwriting was practiced and clear because these books might need to be read decades later, might be presented as evidence in legal disputes, might be examined by partners or heirs. A major innovation was about to transform accounting and banking, the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's press in Germany in the 1450s made books cheaper and more available. By the 1470s and 1480s, printing presses were operating in Venice. The Aldine Press, established by Aldus Manutius in 1494, became one of the most important printing houses in Europe. For banking, printing meant several things. Account books could be printed with standard forms, columns and headings already in place, making record-keeping easier and more consistent. Commercial manuals could be printed and distributed, spreading knowledge about business practices. Exchange rate tables could be printed and updated regularly. Letters of credit could be printed with standard language, with blanks to fill in for specific amounts and parties. But the most important printed work for banking was published in 1494, the Summa de Arithmetica, Geometria, Proportionii e Proporzionalità by Luca Pacioli. Pacioli was a Franciscan friar, a mathematician, a friend of Leonardo da Vinci. His Summa was an encyclopedic work covering mathematics, but one section dealt specifically with bookkeeping, what Pacioli called the Venetian method, what we now call double-entry accounting. Pacioli didn't invent double-entry bookkeeping. Venetian merchants had been using versions of it for decades, maybe centuries. But Pacioli codified it, explained it systematically, provided examples and illustrations. His work became a textbook. Any merchant who could read, and literacy was increasing, could learn the Venetian method of keeping accounts. What had been specialised knowledge passed down through apprenticeship became publicly available information. This matters more than it might seem. When everyone uses the same accounting methods, when books are kept according to common principles, business becomes easier. A merchant in Venice examining the accounts of a partner in Bruges could understand the records because they used the same system. Loans could be evaluated by examining borrowers' books. Partnerships could be audited. Fraud became easier to detect because deviations from standard practice were more visible. The sophistication of Venetian commercial law had also advanced considerably. Venice had developed a whole body of law dealing with commercial disputes, contracts, partnerships, bills of exchange. There were specialized courts for commercial cases. Judges who heard these cases were often themselves merchants or former merchants who understood business. Legal precedents accumulated, creating consistency. Contracts could be enforced reliably, which made people more willing to enter into contracts with strangers or over long distances. Consider how insurance had evolved. By the mid-1400s, marine insurance was becoming standardized. You could insure a cargo for a specified premium, perhaps 5% of the cargo's value, and if the ship was lost, the insurer would compensate you. Insurance contracts specified exactly what was covered. Some policies covered only total loss. If the ship sank completely, you were compensated. If it arrived damaged but intact, you weren't. Other policies covered partial loss. The contracts specified the route the ship would take, what cargo it carried, who the captain was. Deviations from the agreed terms could void the insurance. Insurers themselves needed to manage risk. If you insured 10 ships and all of them happened to sail in a convoy that was destroyed by a storm, you'd be ruined. So insurers developed practices to spread risk. They would insure only a portion of any single cargo, leaving the ship owner to insure the rest with other insurers. They would insure ships sailing to different destinations rather than concentrating all their risk on one route. They would form syndicates where multiple insurers shared the risk and the premiums on large policies. Record-keeping for insurance was meticulous. Insurance brokers kept registers noting every policy written, every premium collected, every claim paid. These records allowed them to calculate their overall risk exposure. To adjust premiums based on experience, if ships to a particular destination were lost frequently, premiums for that route would increase. They could also identify fraud. If a merchant made suspiciously frequent claims, if losses always seemed to happen to his cargoes, the pattern would be visible in the records. Venice's reach by 1450 extended from England to China, though the connections at the far ends were indirect. Venetian merchants didn't travel to China themselves. Marco Polo's famous journey in the late 1200s had been exceptional, not routine. But Venetian goods reached China through intermediaries. Venetian gold and silver travelled east. Chinese silk and porcelain travelled west. The journey might take years and pass through dozens of hands, but the trade existed and Venetian bankers financed portions of it. Trade with the Ottoman Empire presented interesting complications. The Ottomans had conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire that Venice had both traded with and exploited. Venice and the Ottomans were religious enemies, Christian versus Muslim, and they fought periodic wars. But they also traded extensively because both sides found it profitable. The Venetians maintained quarters in Ottoman cities. They paid tariffs to the Sultan, but gained access to markets. Ottoman merchants came to Venice despite theological prohibitions on both sides against dealing with infidels. Commerce overcame religious division, or at least created pragmatic exceptions. Venice traded with Muslim Egypt, with Muslim Syria, with the Muslim-ruled cities of North Africa. The goods were too valuable, the profits too large, for religious scruples to prevent trade. This created moral complexities that Venetians navigated through various rationalizations. Trading with Muslims wasn't helping them wage war against Christians, the argument went, because you were buying luxury goods, not weapons. You were actually strengthening Christian Venice economically, which made Venice better able to defend Christendom. And besides, if you didn't trade with them, Genoese or Florentine merchants would, and they would get the profit. These arguments were self-serving but persuasive enough for Venice to maintain its eastern trade despite occasional papal condemnations. Competition with other banking centres intensified during the 1500s. Florence had the Medici Bank, which at its height in the mid-1400s was the largest bank in Europe, lending to kings and popes. The Medici had something Venice lacked, a dynastic continuity and a willingness to engage directly in political power. The Medici became rulers of Florence, Venetian banking families remained merchants first, serving in government but not dominating it in the same way. German banking houses were rising as well. The Fuggers of Augsburg became enormously wealthy, financing the Holy Roman Emperors and the silver mines of Central Europe. They had advantages Venice couldn't match: direct access to European silver production, proximity to the imperial court, connections to the growing Atlantic trade. But Venice maintained advantages of its own. The arsenal could still produce ships faster than anyone. The accumulated commercial expertise of centuries meant Venetian merchants understood markets and trade routes better than newer competitors. The bond markets and government finance systems were more developed than elsewhere. The legal framework for commerce was more sophisticated, and Venice controlled key routes: the Adriatic, access to the eastern Mediterranean, connections to the German lands through Alpine passes. The physical beauty of Venice in the 1400s reflected and reinforced its wealth. The great palaces along the Grand Canal were being built or expanded: Ca' d'Oro with its gold-leafed facade, Ca' Foscari, dozens of others. San Marco's Basilica gleamed with Byzantine mosaics and looted treasures. Painting was flourishing. The Bellini family, Carpaccio, Giorgione were creating works that still hang in museums. The wealth generated by banking and trade was being transformed into art and architecture that would outlast the commercial empire that produced it. The city was also physically distinctive. Visitors from northern Europe marvelled at the canals, at a city without horses or carriages, where everything moved by boat. The bridges, the narrow streets, the tall buildings crowded together, the marketplace at the Rialto, all of it was unique, recognizable, memorable. Venice was becoming not just a commercial centre, but a destination, a place people wanted to see. Tourism wasn't yet an industry, but wealthy travellers would detour to visit Venice, and while there they would often conduct business, making contacts, arranging trades, opening relationships that might lead to future profit. Cultural sophistication accompanied commercial sophistication. Wealthy Venetian families collected books, art, rare objects. They patronized musicians and poets. They hosted elaborate entertainments. This wasn't just frivolous display. It was networking, relationship building, demonstrating creditworthiness. If you could afford to host a banquet for 50 guests with multiple courses and entertainment, you were clearly solvent. If your house was filled with valuable art, you had resources. Conspicuous consumption was also conspicuous solvency. The education of merchant children was rigorous and practical. Boys, and occasionally girls, though less formally, learned mathematics from an early age. They studied commercial correspondence, learning to write clear letters. They learned languages, at minimum Latin and Venetian dialect, often also Greek, Arabic, German, French. They studied geography and navigation. They apprenticed with their fathers or uncles, learning business by doing it. By their teens, they might be sent on trading voyages to gain experience. By their 20s, they were expected to be competent merchants and bankers in their own right. Partnership structures had become extremely sophisticated. A large trading venture might involve a dozen partners with different percentages of ownership, different responsibilities, different profit shares. The contracts specifying all this would run for pages, covering every contingency the notaries could imagine. What happened if one partner died? If the ship was captured by pirates? If the goods arrived damaged? If market prices had changed dramatically between when the contract was signed and when the goods were sold? All of this was addressed in the contract, witnessed, recorded, enforceable in court. The Venetian state itself was run increasingly like a business. Officials were elected for fixed terms. They kept detailed records. They were audited. They were prohibited from certain conflicts of interest. A magistrate couldn't judge cases involving his own family's business interests, for instance. The line between public service and private commerce was blurry. But there were rules about where that line fell, and violations could be punished. By 1500, by the turn of the 16th century, Venice stood at the absolute peak of its power and sophistication. The population had reached perhaps 150,000. The merchant fleet was the largest in the Mediterranean. Venetian bankers operated across Europe and beyond. The bond markets were deep and liquid. The accounting methods were systematic. Commercial law was developed and reliable. The arsenal could launch a fully equipped war galley in a day if necessary. This was the culmination of 1,000 years of development. Years from refugees in the mud to the banking capital of the medieval world. Everything Venice had learned about ships, about trade routes, about currencies, about risk, about partnerships, about accounting, about law, had been integrated into systems that worked, that generated wealth, that made Venice powerful and influential far beyond what its size would suggest. But standing at a peak means that the only direction to go is down, and changes were already underway. Forces beyond Venice's control that would gradually shift the centre of commerce and finance away from the Mediterranean. We'll explore those changes soon. For now, picture Venice in 1500. The Rialto crowded with merchants, the canals filled with boats, the palaces gleaming, the account books balanced, the ships sailing out toward distant ports, carrying letters of credit and commercial contracts, bringing back silks and spices and the profits that built a city on nothing but water and ambition, and a fierce determination to turn trade into wealth, and wealth into power. And power into beauty that still endures 500 years later. And so we've travelled together through 1,000 years, from mud and salt water to marble palaces and account books that balanced empires. We've watched refugees become merchants, merchants become bankers, and bankers teach the world how money could flow like water through channels of trust and paper promises. Venice is still there, of course. The canals still flow with the tides. The buildings the bankers built still stand, beautiful and slightly sinking. Tourists walk where money changers once sat at their tables, where ship captains once negotiated cargo rates, where the whole complex machinery of the medieval finance hummed with quiet efficiency. The banks are gone, but what they invented remains. Every time money moves without coins travelling, every time a letter of credit crosses borders, every time accounts balance in double-entry books, Venice whispers from 500 years ago, teaching us still. Let yourself sink deeper now. Let your breathing slow. The story is complete. The journey finished. Somewhere. Water laps against ancient stone. Somewhere, the lagoon reflects stars that shone on refugees and doges and bankers alike, indifferent and eternal. You've done enough today. You've listened well. Now rest. Let the gentle current of sleep carry you out into the lagoon, into the darkness, into peace. Good night wherever you are. Sleep well. The water remembers everything and forgives.